Hello, I'm Shekhar Shah at the National Council of Applied Economic Research, and it's a great pleasure to have Professor Arvind Panagariya with us. Arvind, of course, is not only an old friend at Columbia University, the Jagdish Bhagwati Professor of Political Economy,
Indian political economy
at Columbia. He's also a non-resident senior fellow of long standing at NCAER, and most importantly for this conversation, one of the editors for the India Policy Forum that has just concluded its 10th event this year in July in New Delhi. And I'm going to have the pleasure of talking to Arvind about both the India Policy Forum and the 10 years of stewardship that he and my predecessor Suman Berry at NCER and Barry Bosworth at Brookings have provided to this institution, which now is firmly embedded in the academic and intellectual calendar in Delhi. So welcome, Arvind.
Thank you, Shekhar. Always a pleasure to be at the NCAER. I always look forward to my visits here.
So Arvind, you have at this point in time, with Barry not being in New Delhi, the longest running memory and history of the India Policy Forum. So one can't but be asking you this question, one can't help asking you this question, how has it been, what has it felt? These 10 years is a very long time to be associated with an institution, and it really has now become an institution.
Yes, indeed.
Your thoughts on this?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, so, we started 10 years ago. I remember distinctly there was a meeting at the Brookings Institution to do an initial discussion of what this might be about. Mm-hmm. And then gradually from there on it took shape. And someone showed good leadership, and we put together a panel, advisory panel, we put together a research panel, and in fact, we're pretty much, you have now augmented that panel, both of those panels a bit, but largely we made such good choices at the time that that panel has survived. Mm-hmm. And it has been exciting 10 years, as if that had not been the case, of course, none of us would have stuck to it for 10 years.
Right. What have been some of the highlights, thinking back on both the exchanges at the IPF, because the papers themselves, while they are useful, they form the foundation. Certainly in the three that I have been an integral part of, the conversations around the table themselves are often even more interesting, given the quality, the fact that you are putting together perhaps 10, 15 of the top 30 economists working on India. And in that respect, just the exchanges between them around the topic of each paper, or in recent years as we've started around the policy roundtable, those have been fascinating for me. What has been sort of the most important thing that you've sensed and you've got out of the IPF?
No, absolutely. There's no question that these discussions are extremely important part of, otherwise academics, when they run journals, you can simply, don't even need to meet. You just have people submit articles and you put it through refereeing process, and the journal works like that. Most journals work like that. But this one was a different model. We knew from the beginning. We took advantage of the existing model of the Brookings papers on economic activity and tried to model after it. And we, from the beginning, saw very much these discussions at the conference, the very critical element in getting the journal off the ground, and also I think this was meant to reach out to the policymakers, and the very fact that some of the leading policymakers are often present at the forum means that there is a very quick dissemination of the ideas that are...
I'm particularly reminded of last year's conference and the fact that the paper that we had by Karthik Muralidharan on primary school education, and the fact that Narendra Jadhav, the member of the Planning Commission who heads the work on education at the Planning Commission, chaired that session. And at the end of the session he said this paper is a game changer and that he's having to he would have to go back to the Planning Commission and modify the almost final draft of the education chapter in the 12th five-year plan. And indeed, that is what happened, that there are many things that are directly taken from the paper almost into the plan document. So that certainly, I think, sets it off. How do you see it evolving?
Well, I mean, it was a little bit about it, how it has evolved, and what kind of philosophy drove it, and how the participants actually reshaped it perhaps a bit. So when we started initially with Brookings Papers on Economic Activity, it was largely about macro.
Yes.
And in the Indian case, certainly this had been the case, that there was very little bit of macro being done on India. So this is a critical kind of lacuna in the amount of in the research that actually existed. That part turned out to be tough going, precisely because so little existed.
Exactly.
So there were so few potential contributors, and especially if you're looking for quality manuscripts, that was a hard thing to do. So that has been a bit of a struggle, and in the meantime, of course, also simply because so much of the development economics research, including that on India, is being done more in the applied micro kind of field. A lot of our research panelists and our advisory panel were more into the micro.
Applied micro.
So in fact, I remember that in the initial years, these applied micro economists, when we would meet and try to reassess what happened, they really pushed for more micro stuff.
Right.
So I think there's some bit of shaping. We ended up going a bit farther into applied micro than was the original conception. But this is how it evolves. Now, looking to the future, I think we are proactively still trying to push macro as in this particular last one, the 10th anniversary.
Two papers, one on monetary policy.
We had two papers, although it's still kind of in the end
quality is still not what we would like it to be.
Plus also in the end we had to go to the Reserve Bank of India, and our second paper was by our executive director at the International Monetary Fund. I mean, so institutional affiliation does constrain people, and so ideally we would like some sort of unconstrained contributions. But
actually, that should be a challenge for us this coming year now, to really start identifying young, serious macroeconomists who could write about India's situation, and clearly we have a situation in some sense.
That's right.
And so something that we could do then and would be extremely timely.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. In fact, I mean, right now, if we get going on the next issue, perhaps this is a good time to actually scout around for at least 2 or 3 good, solid macroeconomists and ask them. They could probably, since there is a leg of 1 year from now on for the next one, we may have good success.
What accounts for something that to me has been quite distinctive? Watching it at close quarters these past 3 years. But even before that, the occasional time when I was in India and happened to be participating, what's been unusual from other such research-oriented conferences is what you said earlier, the policy maker presence.
Right.
That is quite unusual. And this is at the senior-most levels of government, the finance minister, the deputy chairman of the planning commission, members of the planning commission, the odd cabinet rank minister who's also a trained economist has come by. So that's quite unusual.
It is, and it is to the credit of the journal, as well as, of course, NCAER, which has been very successful in actually drawing in the various senior policymakers into this. And of course, as you know, we have had 3 meetings with the Prime Minister also.
Yes.
And I know that the Prime Minister always likes to receive a whole set of papers as soon as the first drafts come in. So we have often actually, as you know very well, given out, even if we don't actually get a meeting with him, which we don't every year.
But we did this year.
This year we got one, and but even in the years that there is no meeting, we sent him the papers, and he's of course an avid reader, so he does go through those papers.
I suspect it also has to do with the fact that in one place you're seeing 10, 12, 15 of, as I said earlier, some of the most prominent economists, both Indian and non-Indian, working on India and interested in India.
No, that's very true.
And just having that assembly in
Yeah.
one place means that you're assured that the quality of the discourse is going to be of a very high order.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, this is the big attraction for the policymakers here, that they recognize that here are some of the best minds working on India in one place.
Right.
And so I'm sure, they also enjoy this intellectual interaction, and so
Certainly,
makes it a little easier.
Montag, when he chaired the roundtable on what kind of a safety net system India should have, seemed to be enjoying himself.
Very much so, very much so. And I could see that he didn't want to leave, but in the end, he did have another engagement, and and of course the discussion was going so strong that discussion still continued, but unfortunately he had to leave early.
And what sort of, given that NCR is the prime architect, the prime contractor, and the prime sort of fitting out specialist on this conference, since we do everything from A to Z almost here in Delhi, what does this imply for NCAER in terms of how we evolve ourselves, that is, the parent evolved with this child that seems to have done well? Should we be doing more of this kind of thing? Should we be linking more of the younger people into this? And if you were to, given that you're based in New York, you're based at Columbia, you yourself are also a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings, so how do you see the terrain for policy think tanks in India evolving? And how do you see NCAR growing or not growing with it?
No, I think this is a very, very good question. Actually, NCAR, at least particularly in terms of having launched this journal and therefore stimulated a lot of the thinking on the Indian economy, both macro and micro, has done superbly well. But I think there's a broader issue here that, it's still, I think our think tanks are a bit, I would say, in infancy when I compare what goes on in the United States. I mean, one of the things in the United States is that there's sufficiently large number of think tanks, and so some of these think tanks also represent a particular viewpoint.
Sure.
And so I really like that, actually, because for economists and intellectuals, you make progress by sharpening your differences. I mean, unlike the politicians, where you try to blur the differences to,
confuse the voter, get his vote, and run. No,
and so having think tanks which are coming from a slightly different, even if it's an ideological position, but coming from, because still ultimately the analysis is forced on them. So it really helps sharpen the arguments on both sides. That is the sort of thing we still don't quite see here. I think our approach, I suppose, maybe this from coming from some kind of history, is to let's cooperate and coordinate. So rivalry positions we seem not to like, which has its own merit, of course, but some bit of rivalry actually is not a bad thing. And even on subjects that are similar, more than one think tank can be thinking about a lot of the macroeconomic issues coming from different angles, about growth, about poverty, about social programs. And I think it will be good to have a bit more of this, at least some specialization. So NCAER perhaps could articulate one view. And then we got, National Institute of Public Finance Policy that may have a different view, and then NCAER, CPR. So I think it'd be nice, actually, for think tanks to stand for, at least in some ways, you don't want to be too polarized kind of institutions, but at least articulating some bit of a view.
So the think tanks that one immediately comes to mind when one thinks of prominence and preeminence, Brookings, Carnegie Center for Global Development, the more conservative think tanks on the other side of the street, so to speak. they tend to excel not in doing primary research. Very few of the fellows, for example, at any of these prominent places are really seriously now publishing in serious referee journals. They are more taking positions, they are using their immense expertise and knowledge of the field to be able to make quick pronouncements, to be able to shape the policy dialogue and the discussion. And certainly I'm thinking more the US ones, the UK ones may be perhaps a little different in the Anglo-Saxon world. In that respect, we are probably, as you said, far away from getting to those. Partly it's a problem of talent and drawing in enough of that talent, then liberating them from the, and I don't mean to say liberating them from quality, but allowing them to take policy positions in public, being able to debate them, being able to defend them. That's, as you said, somewhat alien to the culture. And we need to build that. And I'm hoping that actually the onshore presence of the American think tanks in India, for example, will begin to introduce some of that.
Possibly. Well, I think a little bit, I'll put it slightly differently though, that it is true that the think tanks in the US, Brookings, American Enterprise Institute, Carnegie Endowment, they are not doing the cutting edge research. I mean, not in the kind of research that would go in the American Economic Review or Quarterly Journal. But at the same time, they do serious applied research. And when they take policy positions, there is at least some bit of serious paper behind it.
Sure.
And that's what we would like to have also. That looking at on any of the major policy issues that come through, let us have our serious research done. Even if, again, if it's not of the kind that you would that would go into the most prestigious, professionally prestigious economics journals, but that would be solid, serious work, and that should form then the basis of any kind of policy positions that people take. Also, I think US is slightly different in the sense that there is also this tradition that when the Republicans go into administration, then the Democrats are out of it, and so those Democrats then come out and sit at the think tanks, and reverse when the Democrats win the White House and form the government.
So we need resting
the Republicans, but it gives
a certain dynamic.
A certain dynamic, and in a way they are preparing them. So the whole point is that they are all expecting that we are going to now win the next election, and so they're preparing themselves, and so they study. So that also actually connects better the research to the policy world, policy making world, because people who ultimately go into the administration, at least maybe not the secretaries level or what are called ministers here, but certainly the next level or next to next level.
Lyle Brainerd is a very good example of that at Brookings, where she's gone back into government having headed the foreign policy department or division of Brookings. So that gives me the idea. Maybe we should create a left wing and a left side of NCR and a right side of NCR. Whoever is out of power can occupy that side.
Look, So that's the alternative model, right? I mean, I was saying that one way is to have something like American Enterprise Institute, which is a bit more on the conservative side, and another called Cato,
of course, which is also
much more conservative. And then you got more liberal, Carnegie Endowment, Brookings, etc. That's one model. But of course, we can also have an alternative model, which is to some degree you could say Carnegie Endowment model, because they have a big tent, and so you got conservatives and liberals.
And it's not identifiable clearly as the others are, as being one or the other camp.
Right, exactly.
What kind of things should we be thinking of? When I think about NCAER, of course, apart from its immense legacy, the fact that it's only 5 years younger than the country itself, it was set up almost immediately after independence, and the fact that it itself and its work program shows the same shifts in fashion or fact or political leanings that India itself and its economy and its policy framework has shown. But from the very beginning, there was something or two things that certainly were very distinctive. One, its independence. Despite it being so close to government, and that proximity has remained over the years, but that closeness to government is certainly something quite unique in that respect. And the second is, despite the independence, and the second is that it still to this day is perhaps one of the few think tanks globally that does primary data collection in of a serious kind. How can we build on those two? Those two. That's fine. You can turn it off.
Hello? सात बजे या ठीक right.
Okay. So as I was asking, so I think one is the proximity to government and the trust that NCR clearly enjoys, which is part legacy, part vintage, part just having been around for so long and having done so much work that has fed the policy machine, so to speak. And the other is its data collection capabilities, which are also very unusual for a policy think tank. Hardly any policy think tank does that. How can we build on those two assets to take NCR to the next avatar or the next version
Well,
of
you know,
NCR?
for any organization to really succeed and flourish, the key ingredient is the people. So I think, you know.
That's where you come in, because you have to identify those people for us in the United States.
Yes. And here too. But I mean, I'm optimistic because as India grows richer, I think this is where, you know, growth has all kinds of different spillovers.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that happens is that as the country grows richer, more and more people will come back, you know, even if they go for higher education to the United States, UK, Australia, Canada,
Mm-hmm.
they'll come back. Mm-hmm. Already we see that happening now. You know, the economy has slowed down, so again we see
Sure.
some lull.
Sure.
But there is no question, and I mean, and also those who might, you know, have stayed in the past there might return and all. So I think the ability to build up will progressively improve. Mm-hmm. Now, the other part of the problem that our institutions need to solve is not purely just a specific NCAER problem, but is general problem in the entire education system in India, which is, I mean, two related things. One, that there has to be some kind of merit-based evaluation. And then there has to be some freedom in setting the salaries, much greater freedom than we do. So, you know, the brightest people today can get 10 times the salaries in the private sector than what under the rules you are allowed to pay, or given your resources you're able to pay. That creates a problem, because then, you know, the best talent is actually gone somewhere else. We will have to increasingly deal with this issue, both the think tanks, universities, and all also. But we also need to change the system, because, you know, we don't reward merit, everybody is the same. But that kind of system then doesn't produce, you know, after all, look, why is our industry flourishing so much more today than it did during the license permit Raj? Because now it has to compete against the best in the world. If Maruti doesn't produce a good car, well, you know, you got Ford producing cars here, and General Motors producing cars here, they will outcompete them. So you really are on your toes, and that's the kind of competition. Like, but, you know, this can work only if rewards are given. In the marketplace, they get rewards, because if they do well, then they sell their cars. And likewise, you know, if some specific individuals are doing better than others, I think they should be at least on the margin rewarded.
I have tons of things to talk to you about NCR, but I know that time is limited. So I actually am going to turn to something much more topical. Two things that we discussed at the India Policy Forum, and it'd be very good to, having reflected on those conversations in the last 2 days, and given that these are both hot issues at the moment in Delhi, and actually in anybody's mind who's watching India from outside. One is our current macroeconomic situation, and second, where we seem to be going in terms of creating a welfare system that is either going to be effective, both in terms of delivering to those who need that welfare, being able to afford it, being able to sustain it, being able to evolve it and adapt it as the economy changes itself. On those two issues, be very useful to hear your sense.
Yeah. Okay.
So on the macro,
yeah.
particularly.
First on the macro, I have been generally quite upbeat on India, optimistic. So
very upbeat.
so
lone voices sometimes.
yes, because some fundamentals are still intact. Nothing has really changed about them. Savings rate remains high. It has declined maybe 3 or 4 percentage points, but still 30% plus. That's a pretty high savings rate. We remain an open economy. In fact, if anything, in very recent times, we have opened a bit more to foreign investment.
Right.
So competitive pressures that are required for continuous increases in productivity is there. I also think that we are still, very far from the global productivity frontier. So gains from catching up with the rest of the world are very much still there. So all those fundamentals are still there. And I've also felt actually for quite some time that our macro is very sound. I remember 10 years ago, we had a conference here in New Delhi, actually organized, I think, by the International Monetary Fund and then IPFP together, where the paper on which I commented was trying to warn that there might be a crisis, another 1991 style crisis in India within next year or two. And I was completely of the opposite view that crisis was nowhere in sight. And it didn't happen. 10 years have passed. We haven't had a crisis. In fact, in between, some fiscal consolidation happened and all. Today, for the first time, I feel a little shaky. Because
just a little or a lot?
well,
because that is a big difference.
Probably less than most others. But I think now one cannot. In terms of placing probabilities, this is a subjective matter. But solid 10% to 15% chance now remains. We are into that kind of territory that there is easily about 10 to 15% chance that we might actually get another 1991 style or some other form of crisis. What has happened is that in good times we did not accumulate reserves. So 2009-10, 2010-11, those were
when
good
the
years.
rupee was appreciating.
So there's a good time to accumulate foreign exchange reserves. We didn't do that. I think we just.
Funnily enough, the whole aspect of leaving the rupee alone happened at the wrong time.
It is, exactly. And now...
And we didn't think ahead that QE had to be wrapped up at some point. And when that was going to be wrapped up, there was going to be a major shock to the international financial system.
Yeah, no, that too. But, in fact, in addition, it's even worse that we were not paying attention also to what we ourselves were doing. Meaning that...
Fiscally,
fiscal, but also on the external account. We are progressively opening it. Capital account was being progressively opened. More and more external commercial borrowing was happening.
Yes.
We also permitted foreign investors to buy our financial instruments. So the government bonds and securities, etc. And this is the kind of capital that can move out a little faster than others. But even ultimately, portfolio investment can also move out. So we kind of were doing this. Our external liabilities were rising. So there was every reason for us, even quite independently of the QE too, to accumulate foreign exchange reserves in good times. We just didn't do it. Now today you got,
what would explain that? It seems so obvious.
Exactly. And it's not like we were not writing about it. I was writing about it.
Why was it not done? What political constellation of forces led to this inaction or deliberate action?
My theory on this is that this was the time that the United States was pressuring China about not manipulating the exchange rate, and somehow maybe we decided that we'll be the good boys and we'll not manipulate the exchange rate, and so we adopted a hands-off policy. At the same time, I think there was some pressure from the finance ministry and maybe the RBI felt that we got to bring in more capital, And so they started opening all this external commercial borrowing, the investments into our bonds and securities by the foreign institutional investors. So now today we have about, this is according to newspaper reports, so I haven't actually checked the official figures, but apparently according to one such report, $200 billion worth of debt abroad is completely uncovered. So, these are private firms' liabilities. These are liabilities of the private companies.
And that's set against a reserve of 300 billion.
Yeah, that's exactly. So, that was the other insurance. That insurance is not good enough either. So it is, and then now on top of that you add the reversal of QE2. I mean, now if the United States kind of begins to turn back its on its monetary expansion and begins to raise the interest rates, that of course would mean that the capital will, from all emerging markets, not just India, from all emerging markets, is going to flow back to the US in pursuit of those high returns. And that, of course, what we do not realize is that something like $150 billion worth of for investment moving out of India is not hardly a big deal for the United States. A very small potatoes for the large market that they have. But for India, that's a huge outflow.
It can create havoc.
Yeah, it can create havoc. So that's the macro.
If you were, not that I think you'd ever accept it, but if you were in the RBI governor's chair, what sort of things would you be thinking about?
I firmly believe that a person in that chair ought to have a pretty good knowledge of monetary policy, good macro. I never think of myself as a macroeconomist. I just dabble in these things. I just dabble, can write a column here and a column there. But I have a reasonable kind of policy sense, so I can think through. But RBI governor's job, of course, is incredibly complex these days.
And on the fiscal side, and that's the second part of my question, in a sense.
Right. Yeah. No. On the fiscal side, consolidation has to happen, but much more so. I mean, in the end, the bigger part of the problem is to really bring back reforms to the center stage, and if we can really and solve this paralysis that exists, and start clearing at a rapid pace all the projects that are currently stuck. I think in the end there's no antidote better than faster growth. If we get back to 8-9% growth, I think a lot of the problems can be solved. Otherwise, fiscal consolidation is going to be tough. I mean, without tax revenues, it's harder to cover the deficit. I mean, that's straight, and especially given that. By the way, on that also, when we did our own stimulus, so to say,
well, it sort of preceded the need for the stimulus, but we clothed it as a stimulus.
Yeah, but
loan forgiveness and all that happened before
that also,
Lehman.
But you see, but the big part, a very large chunk of our what we called stimulus was truly not stimulus, because stimulus is supposedly something that you then go back and reverse.
Yes, exactly. It's turning it on and off.
Yeah.
But what we did was a permanent giveaway.
Exactly, permanent social expenditures.
Right.
That's not stimulus. They're social programs which you should not put in place unless you know that your revenue profile down the road will be good enough to cover them. So we in the name of stimulus, we put in these these very large social expenditures in place, which we now cannot reverse. So that was also an issue. So going forward, that makes the fiscal consolidation difficult without returning to serious reforms and getting the 8-9% growth back on track.
So, last question. What would be your advice for the new government, whatever form, substance, composition it takes when the elections are held?
Well,
which will be very soon.
Yeah. I mean, if a new government seriously wants to start off the return to bringing growth back at the center, at the center stage, then it has to issue 2 or 3 very serious major statements, which would signal that the government seriously is going to get back to reform process to revive the economy. a very clear statement, for example, on subsidies, that you would say that look, in the over 5 years period, our roadmap is going to be taking out these subsidies, adding these subsidies. So some broad roadmap. I mean, as an example I'll give you, in 1999, the Vajpayee government announced its new telecom policy. This was basically a statement of intent.
Sure.
And then various elements of the policies were implemented over a period of 3 years or so. There was one element that was not implemented, but that's okay. So you, for example, issue one on subsidies. You issue some statement also on fiscal consolidation in broader meaning, FRBM, what are we going to do with that? Then there has to be some broad statement on industrial or factor market policies. You can do it under the rubric of manufacturing policy or something of the sort. But there has to be a clear roadmap of the reforms, not simply a statement of good sentiments that, we want manufacturing to become 25% of the GDP. Which that is the goal, but the true policy statement has to lay out, these are the policy changes we intend to make over the next 4 or 5 years. And then then the government has to really get down to legislating fairly rapidly. I mean, I would, at least, because the longer they take, the more difficult it will get. So, you take that in the first year, a very massive legislative agenda actually ought to be. So I would really say that those, if the governments really seriously are thinking in terms of how am I going to bring the country out of its current morass, they ought to be actually preparing their road maps of what they will do in the first year of their tenure of 5 years now. I mean, there ought to be a plan in place now.
Well, on that hopeful note and the expectation that they do have such plans underway, and I'm sure that you will be writing as well about what these plans ought to be over the course of the next few months. Let me say thank you very much.
Pleasure.
It's a great
Shekhar,
pleasure
as
talking
always.
to you, Arvind. Thank you.
Great.
Okay.